The thing I remember most clearly isn't the shock on my father's face. It's the weight of the tray. Silver-plated, slightly tarnished on the left edge, loaded with 6 glasses of sparkling water and a bowl of mixed nuts my mother had arranged like they were going to be photographed. I was standing in the hallway just off the kitchen, in a cream blouse I'd ironed that morning, when my father appeared from around the corner, looked me up and down once, and pressed the tray into my hands without a word of greeting. Then he leaned in close enough that I could smell the cedar cologne he only wore when he was trying to impress someone, and he said quietly, like it was completely reasonable, "Stay in the background tonight, Sarah. Don't make it about you. These are important people." I was 31 years old. I had flown in from Chicago that morning. I had a keynote slot at the New York Strategy Summit 14 months earlier, where I'd spoken to a room of 400 executives about supply chain resilience. My slides had been downloaded over 11,000 times. But that evening, in my parents' Naperville home, I was holding a tray of sparkling water and mixed nuts, being told not to embarrass them. I should have set the tray down. I know that now. Instead, I carried it into the dining room, and the moment I stepped through that doorway, a man at the far end of the table looked up from his conversation, paused for exactly 2 seconds and stood up. Not halfway. Fully. "You're Sarah Collins," he said. "The keynote speaker from the New York Summit." I never forgot that talk. His name was Ryan Mitchell. He was the man my family had spent 3 months trying to get into that house. The room went completely silent. My father's confident smile didn't disappear, it just stopped working. My mother's hands froze mid-reach for her wine glass. My sister Megan, seated to Ryan's left in a dress that had cost $340 and a month of subtle parental suggestion, turned and looked at me the way you look at something that wasn't supposed to be there. And I stood there, tray in hand, and felt something shift in my chest. Not triumph. Not yet. Just the quiet, clarifying recognition that I had been invisible in this family for a very long time, and that the invisibility had never once been about my worth. Let me tell you who I actually am, because this story only makes sense if you understand what they were trying to hide. My name is Sarah Collins. I'm 31. I live in a 1-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park, Chicago, that I lease for $1,850 a month and furnish entirely myself. I am a senior strategy consultant at a mid-sized firm called Vantage Advisory Group, where I manage 4 client accounts, 2 junior analysts, and a project pipeline worth approximately $2.3 million annually. I did not inherit any of that. I built it across 7 years, starting as a research assistant making $38,000 a year, taking night courses in data systems and organizational behavior while my family told me I was being too ambitious for someone without a plan. Have a plan. I've always had a plan. The New York Summit keynote came after 2 years of submitting abstracts, being rejected, rewriting, resubmitting, and eventually landing a slot through a contact I made at a conference my company almost didn't send me to because the registration fee was $600 and my manager needed to approve it. 400 people in that room. A standing ovation at the end. I cried in the elevator afterward. Alone, because there was no one in my life at that moment who fully understood what it had taken to get there. My family was not in that room. They had not been invited. Not because I was ashamed of them, but because I had learned over 31 years that bringing my family into spaces where I was competent created a specific kind of problem. They would minimize it in real time. My mother would ask the person next to her if the chicken was dry. My father would find a way to redirect the conversation toward Megan. Megan, my younger sister, is 27, works part-time at a boutique in the suburb where we grew up, and has been gently, persistently, lovingly positioned by my parents as the family's social centerpiece since approximately the 3rd grade. Megan is warm. Megan is beautiful. Megan is also, to be entirely fair to her, not fully responsible for what our parents built around her. The system was never Megan's design, but she benefited from it every single day. And I paid for it in ways that took me years to fully calculate. There's a specific kind of family erasure that doesn't leave bruises. It leaves paperwork. Leaves patterns. It leaves a 31-year-old woman standing in a hallway holding a serving tray, wondering at what point she stopped expecting anything different. Let me give you 3 examples. Because I've learned that when you're the invisible child, You tend to keep receipts, not out of bitterness, but because some part of you always suspected you'd need them. The first example is the college fund. My parents set aside money for both of us to attend university. Megan's portion was $22,000, earmarked in a savings account my father managed. Mine was the same in theory. In practice, when I turned 18 and was accepted to the University of Illinois on a partial merit scholarship, my father sat me down and explained that my tuition gap, roughly $11,400 for the first year, would need to be covered by a student loan because the markets weren't cooperating. I signed the loan documents without fully understanding them. I paid off the last installment 6 years ago. Megan enrolled in a local private college 4 years later. Her tuition gap, $14,800, was covered in full. No loans, no conversation about markets. My mother bought her a new laptop and a dorm room rug from Pottery Barn. I found this out not from my parents, but from Megan herself, during a Christmas argument about something completely unrelated. She mentioned it like it was common knowledge. It wasn't common knowledge to me. The second example is the business introduction. In 2021, my father attended a regional Chamber of Commerce dinner and met a man named Gerald Howe, a logistics company owner who was looking for a strategy consultant to help him restructure his supplier contracts. This was almost precisely what I do for a living. My father knew this. He had attended my company's client dinner the year before. He had shaken hands with my managing director. He referred Gerald Howe to a college acquaintance of Megan's boyfriend instead. A man named Todd who had 18 months of freelance experience and a Squarespace website. When I found out, I asked my father directly. He said, and I want you to hear the exact phrasing, "I didn't think you needed the business, Sarah. You seem to be doing fine." I had $17,000 in credit card debt at the time from a slow client quarter. I was doing fine in the same way that a person treading water is technically not drowning. The third example is the dinner itself, or rather what led to it. Ryan Mitchell was not a random guest. My father had been trying to build a social connection with him for nearly 3 months, ever since Ryan's firm, Mitchell Logistics Tech, announced a regional expansion that would require external advisory services. My father, who is in regional sales and not consulting, had some vision of positioning himself as a connector, a useful friend, the kind of man who knew the right people. He had arranged this dinner through a mutual acquaintance. He had told Megan to look her best, coached her on talking points about Ryan's company, and set her seat directly to Ryan's left. The plan, as far as I could reconstruct it, was for Megan to charm Ryan socially while my father leveraged the goodwill into a business conversation. What no one in that house knew, what my father had no mechanism to know, because he had never once Googled my professional name in a context that wasn't about whether I was okay financially, was that Ryan Mitchell had been in that room in New York 14 months ago, that he had taken notes during my session, that he had sent a connection request on LinkedIn that I had accepted and then, honestly, forgotten about because I had 40 other things happening that week. My father had spent 3 months engineering a room to impress Ryan Mitchell. He had accidentally put the one person Ryan already respected directly in the kitchen. That should have been the end of it. A strange, uncomfortable evening that I'd have quietly filed away with all the others. It wasn't. The dinner lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. I know because I checked my phone when I finally sat down in my car afterward. Hands steady on the steering wheel, engine off, staring at the garage door of my parents' house through the windshield. 3 hours and 40 minutes of being the most interesting person in the room while being treated like the help. After Ryan stood up, after that first electric moment of recognition that nobody in my family quite knew how to process, my father recovered quickly. That's one thing I'll give David Collins. He is a fast adapter in social situations. Within 90 seconds he had inserted himself between Ryan and me, physically, with his hand extended and a laugh that was about 15% too loud, redirecting the conversation toward himself, toward Megan, toward the house renovation they'd done in 2022 that nobody had asked about. My mother appeared at my elbow and gently, wordlessly, took 2 of the glasses off my tray and began distributing them as though we had always planned this together. As though I had always been the caterer. Megan looked at me once, quickly, with an expression I can only describe as territorial. I sat down at the table, at the far end near the kitchen. There was no name card at my seat because there had been no seat planned for me at all. My mother had added a chair between the corner and the wall, the kind of last-minute placement that announces itself without saying anything. Ryan noticed. I watched him notice. He said nothing at the time, but twice during the first hour he turned the conversation in my direction. Asked me about the summit presentation, about a framework I discussed regarding inventory resilience, about whether I was still doing work in the logistics space. Each time I answered. Each time, my father found a way to bridge the response back to himself or to a compliment about Megan's head for business. Megan, who has never filed a business tax return in her life. Sarah, I actually reached out to your firm's intake page last quarter. I didn't hear back. I assumed you were booked out. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a family realizing that an opportunity had passed through their house in both directions simultaneously. My father's expression shifted through at least 4 emotions in under 3 seconds. I watched his jaw tighten. And then he said, quietly, pleasantly, in the tone he uses when he is most dangerous. Oh, Sarah didn't mention she had availability issues. She tends to keep us out of the loop on the professional side. Ryan looked at him, then looked at me. And I smiled calmly, because I had learned a long time ago that losing composure in front of my father was the one thing he could always use against me. But underneath that composure, something had finally crystallized. Not anger. Something colder and more useful than anger. Clarity. I stayed that night. Not because the evening had softened me toward my parents' home, but because I had a 7 a.m. flight and the Naperville Marriott was $214 and I was, despite everything, still someone who watched her expenses. I slept in my old room, which my mother had converted into a craft space sometime around 2020. My childhood bed had been replaced with a work table. There was a fold-out cot in the closet. I set it up myself, didn't say anything about it, and lay there in the dark for approximately 40 minutes before giving up on sleep entirely. I went downstairs at 2 a.m. to make tea. And that's when I saw the filing cabinet. It was in the corner of my father's home office, a room I had no particular reason to enter, but the door was open and the light from the hallway caught the metal edge of a drawer that had been left slightly ajar. My father is meticulous about that cabinet. He has been meticulous about it my entire life. The fact that it was open, even by 2 inches, was the kind of small domestic anomaly that my brain, trained by years of reading organizational patterns for a living, simply could not walk past. I'm not proud of what I did next, but I'm not ashamed of it either. Open the drawer. It was the 3rd drawer down, the one labeled, in my father's handwriting, estate/family. And near the back, behind a manila folder of homeowners' insurance documents and a folder of Megan's old school records that my mother had apparently kept for sentimental reasons, was a brown accordion file I had never seen before. It was tied shut with a cotton string. On the front tab, in different handwriting, older, slightly shaky, were 2 words. Harold. Final. Harold was my grandfather. My father's father. He had died in March of 2019, a Wednesday, in a hospice facility in Joliet, Illinois, at the age of 78. I had been at his bedside. Megan had sent flowers. I untied the string. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a will dated November 2017. Clean, notarized, structured. It named my father as executor and divided Harold's primary asset, a paid-off residential property in Joliet, that gave me until June 2021. I was sitting in her office in February of that year. Had 4 months. Can we move in 4 months? Yes. We can move in 8 weeks if you get me the originals, she said. I told her I didn't have the originals. She told me the photographs were a foundation. She told me we would need a handwriting analysis, Harold's medical records from that period, and ideally a witness. Someone who had contact with Harold in January 2019 who could speak to his condition. I knew exactly who that witness was. My grandfather's hospice nurse was a woman named Patricia Vance. I had her phone number still saved in my contacts from 2019, because I had called her once after Harold died to thank her, and she had been kind enough to call back. I reached out to Patricia on a Thursday evening, explained that I was looking into some estate matters and would appreciate a brief conversation. She agreed to a call the following week. Patricia remembered my grandfather clearly. She remembered January 2019 specifically, because Harold had experienced a significant medication adjustment that month, a transition to a stronger pain protocol following a decline in his mobility. She remembered that he had had visitors during that period. She remembered specifically that my father had visited twice in January, alone, without my grandmother, who had passed 4 years earlier, without me. She said Harold had seemed confused and tired during that period. That was the phrase she used. I wrote it down exactly. I did not ask Patricia to testify. I asked if she would be willing to provide a written account of Harold's condition in January 2019 for legal purposes if needed. He said she would. She said she had always thought it was unusual that Harold had seemed so unsettled in his final weeks, when he had been so peaceful for the months before. Thanked her. I sent Diane a summary email that evening. Meanwhile, and this is the part that required the most patience, I said nothing to my family. Nothing at all. I texted my mother happy birthday in March. I sent a neutral response to a family group chat about Easter plans. I was warm, unremarkable, and completely present in every surface interaction. My father called me once in late February, with what I can only describe as a probing warmth, the kind of friendliness that has questions underneath it. He mentioned Ryan Mitchell. He mentioned that Ryan had reached out after the dinner. He mentioned with studied casualness that Ryan had asked about you actually. That's nice, I said. Ryan's a thoughtful person. My father paused. Are you in contact with him? We're connected professionally, I said. Which was true. Ryan had sent me a message 2 days after the dinner. We had spoken on the phone once, for 45 minutes, about a potential consulting engagement his company was exploring. I had sent him a preliminary scope document. I had not told my family any of this. He's a significant connection, Sarah. It might be worth. Dad, I said gently. I know how to manage my professional relationships. I've been doing it for a while now. He laughed. I laughed. We hung up. Diane filed the formal contest in May. The court scheduled a hearing for late June. The originals were subpoenaed from my father's filing cabinet by court order, which meant that on a Tuesday morning in late May, a process server arrived at my parents' Naperville home with documentation requiring my father to produce Harold Collins's estate files for judicial review. I was in Chicago when it happened. I was in a client meeting, actually, presenting a supply chain restructuring proposal, when my phone lit up with 6 missed calls from my father's number over the course of 40 minutes. I finished the presentation. Then I stepped outside, stood on the corner of Michigan Avenue in the May afternoon sun, and called Diane instead. The subpoena was served, she confirmed. Good, I said. That was the moment everything shifted. Publicly, structurally, and permanently. The hearing was on a Thursday in late June, in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the DuPage County Courthouse. It was smaller than I expected. Wood-paneled, fluorescent-lit, aggressively ordinary for a room in which something so significant was being untangled. Diane sat beside me. My father sat across the aisle with an attorney he had hired 8 days after the subpoena, a man I had never met who kept straightening his tie. My mother was not there. I had not expected her to be. Megan was not there either. I had not told Megan what I'd filed or why. I had thought about it, genuinely thought about it, and decided that Megan deserved the chance to process this information outside of a courtroom, in her own time, without being positioned as either a villain or a victim before she understood what had actually happened. The handwriting analysis had come back 3 weeks earlier. The examiner's conclusion was that the signature on the January 2019 amendment showed significant variation from authenticated exemplars in pressure, letter formation, and consistency, consistent with an individual experiencing motor impairment. Patricia Vance's written statement had been submitted alongside Harold's medical records from that month, which documented the medication transition and noted reduced fine motor capacity in the attending physician's notes. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, reviewed the submissions carefully. She asked my father's attorney several questions about the circumstances of the amendment's execution. The attorney's answers were, to put it gently, insufficient. The original 2017 will was reinstated. The Joliet property, which my father had quietly listed and sold in 2020 for $362,000, had its proceeds, which had been deposited into that joint family account, subject to a restitution order. My share, calculated at half of the net proceeds after sale costs, came to $174,500, plus interest, calculated from the date of sale. The total figure was $181,240. My father did not look at me when the order was read. He looked at the table. His attorney placed a hand briefly on his arm, which my father shook off. Outside the courthouse on the steps, Diane shook my hand and said, "You were very calm in there." "I've had practice," I said. "I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because I think it matters." It wasn't triumph. It wasn't the satisfaction I might have expected after months of documentation and waiting. It was something quieter and stranger than that. It felt like a room I'd been standing in for 31 years had finally been accurately measured. Like someone had walked in with a tape measure and confirmed that yes, the walls were as close as they had always felt, and yes, I had been right about that and now I could leave. My father called me that evening. I let it go to voicemail. He called again the next morning. Answered. He was not apologetic exactly. He was careful, the way a person is careful when they've been told by an attorney to be careful. He said that the family account had been intended to benefit everyone. He said he had made decisions he thought were in the family's long-term interest. He said he hoped this didn't have to define our relationship going forward. I listened to all of it. I let him finish completely. And then I said, "I hope so too, Dad. I'll be in touch." And I hung up, gently. That was the last substantive conversation we've had. Has now been 7 months. I've responded to group messages, acknowledged birthdays, kept the surface civil. But I have not re-entered that house. I have not accepted another dinner invitation. I have not put myself back in a room where I might be handed a tray. As for Ryan, I want to address this because I know it's part of the story, and I want to be precise about it. Ryan Mitchell and I began working together professionally in March, 3 months after the dinner. His company engaged Vance Advisory for an 8-month restructuring project, and I was the lead consultant. We were professional throughout. We became friends during that time, the kind of friendship that builds quietly over long hours and shared problem-solving. By October it had become something more than that. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic. Just two people who respected each other's minds and found, gradually, that the respect had turned into something warmer. He has never met my parents. He is aware of the broad contours of this story. He has not once suggested I should reconsider any boundary I have drawn. Megan called me in August. We talked for 2 hours. The longest real conversation we've had as adults. She had questions I answered honestly. She had feelings I let her have. She said she hadn't known about the college fund discrepancy, the will, any of it. Believe her. Our relationship is not repaired exactly, but it is, for the first time, real. We are learning each other without the architecture our parents built around us. It is slow and sometimes uncomfortable, and I think it might actually be worth it. Here's what I know now that I didn't know how to articulate when I was standing in that hallway holding a silver tray. Being underestimated by the people who were supposed to see you most clearly is a specific kind of loneliness. It doesn't announce itself as abuse. Looks like family. It uses the language of love. It tells you to stay in the background and calls it consideration. It redirects your inheritance and calls it practical. It hands you a tray and tells you not to embarrass them. Not understanding, or perhaps not caring, that the embarrassment was never yours to carry. I carried it for 31 years. I set it down. And what I found underneath, the competence, the documentation, the quiet patience I'd been building without knowing I was building it, turned out to be more than enough. If you've ever been the one in your family who was handed the tray instead of the invitation, the one who performed and produced and still somehow wasn't seen, I want you to know that the invisibility was never the truth about you.